I'm looking forward to working on a comprehensive immigration bill because, call it whatever you want, that means that more Americans are going to have jobs.
And the House is now in session.
Father Conway.
Let us pray. Dear Lord, we give you thanks for giving us another day. We come to you as a nation in the midst of great uncertainty and worry as people look for causes and solutions. The temptation is great to seek ideological position. We ask that you might send your spirit of peace and reconciliation, that instead of ascendancy over opponents, the members of this people's house and all elected to represent our nation might work together humbly, recognizing the best in each other's hopes to bring stability and direction toward a strong future. This chamber will soon be silent. Members gone for the August recess. The weather continues to damage crops. The economy continues to struggle. Sequestration threatens interests of all Americans from a myriad of points of view. During these coming weeks, may all Americans find respite from their struggles, and may all members of this people's house find rest and resolve to return to the service of these United States as citizens empowered by their constituents to address the needs of the nation. May all that is done be for your greater honor and glory. Amen.
The Chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. Pledge of allegiance today will be led by the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Would our guests join us in the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The Chair will entertain up to 5 requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois rise?
House for 1 minute and revise it.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to remember and recall the life of Carla Anderson. Carla passed away on July 23rd after a month-long fight against an infection. She was 52, a loving mother, devoted wife, and the successful Deputy Executive Director of the Next Generation 911 Institute. It was in this capacity that I had a real privilege of working with her. The 911 Institute became the Next Generation 911 Institute as technology continued to move forward. Congressman Anna Eshoo and I worked closely with the Institute in our position as co-chairs of the Congressional E911 Caucus. Carla's hard work played a vital role in the passage and enactment of significant pieces of legislation passed by Congress to advance 911 services. In so doing, many lives have been saved as first responders throughout the country could not only receive calls but identify the location of the call. In the first responder community, time saves lives, and as technology improved, Carla ensured that the legislation and the education of members improved with it. Carla was laid to rest in her beloved North Dakota. She will be missed by us and the first responder community throughout this country. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Does the gentleman from Florida seek unanimous consent? The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to pay tribute to Captain Lafer, who recently retired after 27 years of service in the United States Navy. Captain Lafer has a proven commitment of valor to his country by fighting for freedom and democracy throughout the world. His 27 years of service, he completed 4 different deployments and will be remembered in service for his strong character, work ethic, and love of country. It is with pleasure that we can say that Captain Lafer will continue his career in public service as a Director of Operations and Planning in the Monroe County School Board. Mr. Speaker, I would like to extend my best wishes to Captain Lafer on his retirement, and in particular to his family and to his wife, Wendy. Our thanks for his continuing contribution to our country and our community. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition?
To address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I rise today to bring attention to the sad truth about sex trafficking in the United States.
The Department of Justice reports that between 2008 and 2010, 83% of sex trafficking victims found in this country were U.S. citizens, and 40% of cases involved the sexual exploitation of children. Just this week, the FBI rescued 105 children from exploitation in 76 U.S. cities, including one from my home state, Minnesota. And sadly, this is an all too common occurrence. The FBI has identified the Twin Cities as one of the nation's 13 largest centers for child prostitution. That's why I've introduced the Child Sex Trafficking Data and Response Act with Congresswoman Slaughter, my colleague. We need to improve data systems that track children, missing children, as well as provide proper designation to ensure that the victims receive the care and help they need. Through increased awareness and a better understanding of this issue, as well as compassion for the victims of sex trafficking, we can take real steps to make sure we stop the abuse of our most vulnerable. And I yield back.
Does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a simple question. Why are we going home in August? And it's really not a rhetorical question. All across southern Minnesota and across this country, farmers and ranchers have been up for hours, quietly going about their business of feeding, clothing, and powering the world. And here we sit a year later without a farm bill to give them the certainty they've asked for. Now, we disagreed on how the farm bill was done here, but this House passed one. The Senate passed one, and just like that Saturday morning cartoon, I'm just a bill sitting on Capitol Hill, we got to get together to finish that. That's called a conference. The Senate appointed their conferees. All you have to do, Mr. Speaker, very seldom you get this simple choice. Appoint conferees and finish our business for America, or go on vacation. That's the choice you get today. Now, I taught 6th grade for many years. The rule in our class was you don't go to recess till you finish your work. I often hear from my friends, we need to run government more like a business. What business owner shuts the door and goes home before finishing critical work? Appoint conferees, finish the farm bill, give certainty, do your work that we're being paid for, and finish the farm bill. With that, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
To address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend.
Without objection, the gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, overreaching regulations are stifling economic growth and destroying jobs. Last year, the administration enacted 1,172 new regulations, which is 16% more than 2011. At the current rate the administration operates, increasing regulations have become the new normal. House Republicans have a plan to stop the record-breaking volume of red tape on small businesses. This week, House Republicans passed legislation to address this government abuse. American job creators should be more concerned about creating jobs rather than worrying about complying with confusing mandates. American taxpayers should be able to keep their hard-earned money to provide for their families rather than facing the burden of higher taxes. It's time to put our economy back on track to job creation. It's my hope the President and Senate will join with us to make full-time job creation the new normal. In conclusion, God bless our troops, and we will never forget September 11th and the global war on terrorism.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Rhode Island seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, 48 years ago this week, President Lyndon Johnson signed into law legislation that formally established Medicare and Medicaid. Promises to seniors that following a lifetime of hard work, they'd be able to retire with economic security and peace of mind and always have access to the guarantee of quality, affordable health care. For nearly half a century, Medicare has provided critical benefits and health care services for seniors in my home state of Rhode Island and all across this country. And today, nearly 200,000 Rhode Islanders receive Medicare benefits. But despite its remarkable success, the promise made through Medicare has come under attack in recent years from my friends on the other side of the aisle. And this week, instead of working with Democrats to address the many challenges facing our country, House Republicans are holding their 40th vote to undermine the Affordable Care Act, a historic health care reform that strengthens Medicare and ensures it can continue to serve seniors today and for generations to come. Our constituents deserve better. Let's set aside partisan politics and commit to preserving Medicare so it continues to provide critical benefits for hardworking seniors in my home state of Rhode Island and all across this great nation. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute. Advise and extend.
Without objection, the gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is with great privilege I rise today to announce the very first recipient of my Citizen Hero Award. I'm so blessed to represent the great people of the 14th District of Illinois. I created this award to honor exemplary constituents in my district who inspire others with their meritorious actions. It's my distinct pleasure to announce Pingree Grove's Adam Castellanos as the award's first recipient. For over 6 years, he has served as a TSA Transportation Security Officer at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. While on duty last month, Adam Castellanos, along with his Transportation Security Administration colleagues, Jacob Neal and Marvin Jackson, helped save a passenger's life. Upon discovering the passenger had passed out and was unconscious, Adam grabbed the closest AED unit and brought it to the man's side while his colleagues called paramedics and performed CPR. I commend their quick-thinking teamwork to save the man's life. Mr. Castellanos, thank you for your service. It is my pleasure to represent you, and I extend my heartfelt gratitude with this award. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Illinois seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This month, America celebrates the 50th anniversary of the historic March on Washington, where men and women of all backgrounds rallied for the cause of jobs and freedom. The march proved instrumental in advancing civil rights in America and helped in passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In remembering that march was about jobs, it's important that we remember that this Congress has yet to bring a jobs bill to the floor. As we recall what the march did to advance freedom, we should remember that the recent Supreme Court ruling on voting rights left it up to Democrats and Republicans in Congress to work out a bipartisan path to protect voters from discrimination and from being disenfranchised. The need for folks to come together on behalf of jobs and justice is as important now as it was 50 years ago. Our nation is made better when we march together to overcome the challenges of our times. I urge my colleagues to unite and pass a jobs bill that's good for American workers and to take the steps necessary to protect every American's right to vote. The march continues. I yield.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, in the President's pivot back to jobs last week, he told a crowd that America has fought its way back 5 years after the start of the Great Recession. 5 years ago, unemployment was at 5%. Today, it's at 6.5%. 5 years ago, the national poverty rate was at 12.5%. Today, it exceeds 15%. 5 years ago, 30 million Americans received food stamps. Today, 47.8 million are enrolled. Now, we are no way back to where we were before the 2008 collapse, and it's the President's economic agenda that's pushing us further into danger. As a business owner for 42 years, I've been on the receiving end of these job-killing policies, and I know what it will take to get the economy back on track. We need true tax reform. We need to get the government out of health care. We need to energize the energy business, and we need to make sure our military remains fully funded and well-equipped and the best in the world. We should never accept 7.6 as the normal level for unemployment or 15% poverty rate, and we should never accept an economy that creates more food stamps than jobs. In God we trust. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Illinois seek recognition?
Consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized.
Last year, I met with a fourth-grade constituent named Lily McSheffrey. Lily was concerned about the impact of oil and gas drilling on sources of drinking water, and she was determined to do something about it. She urged me to introduce a law that would protect consumers from contamination associated with drilling operations. So today, I will introduce the Safe Hydration is an American Right in Energy Development, or SHARED Act. The bill would require testing of water sources near hydraulic fracturing operations and the public disclosure of the results of that testing. The SHARED Act would improve the lives of people all over this country, making sure Lily and future generations of kids have access to safe, clean water. I am inspired by Lily's dedication to this issue, and I urge my colleagues to join as co-sponsors of the SHARED Act. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Pursuant to House Resolution 322 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House in Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the further consideration of H.R. 367. Will the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Womack, kindly take the chair?
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for further consideration of H.R. 367, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to amend Chapter 8 of Title 5 United States Code to provide that major rules of the executive branch shall have no force or effect unless a joint resolution of approval is enacted into law.
When the Committee of the Whole rose on Thursday, August 1st, 2013, a request for a recorded vote on Amendment Number 12, printed in Part B of House Report 113-187, offered by the gentlewoman from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, had been postponed. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on those amendments printed in Part B of House Report 113-187, on which further proceedings were postponed in the following order. Amendment Number 1 by Mr. Scalise of Louisiana. Amendment Number 3 by Mr. Smith of Missouri. Amendment Number 4 by Mr. Latham of Iowa. Amendment Number 6 by Mr. Nadler of New York. Amendment Number 7 by Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Amendment Number 8 by Ms. Jackson-Lee of Texas. Amendment Number 12 by Ms. Moore of Wisconsin. The Chair will reduce to 2 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote after the first vote in this series. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on Amendment Number 1, printed in Part B of House Report 113-187 by the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment Number 1, printed in Part B of House Report Number 113-187, offered by Mr. Scalise of Louisiana.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. Sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
The U.S. House returns for one more session ahead of the 5-week August recess. You heard some mention in earlier speeches about unemployment and jobs, the economy announced by the Labor Department today, adding 162,000 jobs in July, the unemployment rate dropping to 7.4%. On the agenda for the House today, they're going to finish up work on a bill that would bar major federal agency regulations from taking place without congressional approval if those regulations have an economic impact over $100 million. The other bill coming up later would prevent the IRS from enforcing tax penalties under the 2010 health care law. So they're finishing up work here on that regulations bill with first a series of amendment votes, 7 amendment votes. This first one by Steve Scalise of Louisiana would subject any regulation that takes place that places a fee, a price, a levy on pollution like a carbon tax to the congressional approval procedure that's mandated under the bill. This is a 15-minute vote. All of the following amendment votes will be 2-minute votes. For some further details on this bill, the REINS Act, we spoke to a Capitol Hill reporter.
This is Adriel Bettelheim, who is the editor of CQ's Morning Briefing. What's the impetus behind this House bill aimed at reducing government regulations?
All week, the House Republican leadership has been taking aim at what it calls government abuse. They're trying to give members some talking points as they go back to their districts for the August recess, try to whip up some of the anti-Washington fervor that they believe appeals to their base. So there's a package of about 8 bills that they've been passing that in one way or another take aim either at federal workers who've been behaving badly or do things that are perceived as helping average citizens feel more empowered.
Who are some of the bill's key opponents, and what are we hearing in their on-floor messaging?
Well, the White House would be the most prominent opponent. They slapped a veto threat on this, saying it's an unprecedented restriction of government rulemaking that has no justification. And of course, most of the congressional Democrats are against it, and it's very unlikely that the Democratic-controlled Senate would pick up such a bill. Essentially, what they're saying is that government agencies that make rules already have to abide by the laws that give them power to make the rules. They have to do cost estimates. The administration says it's taking great efforts to minimize the cost of new regulations, and that this would essentially take draft rules and send them into months-long limbo through the process that it prescribes.
Well, is this bill meant to be broad, or do supporters of the bill have specific agencies and regulations in mind?
Well, it is a one-size-fit-all approach, but they say there's about 85 or so rules each year that have an economic effect of 100 million or more. And they mention, among others, EPA, transportation, Homeland Security, and the Commerce Department that seem to have done a fair amount of these rules of this magnitude in the last 5 or so years.
Well, of these 85 rules per year, who determines that? Who says this is going to have an impact of $100 million or more?
Well, these are subjected to government cost estimates. In fact, when they publish the rules, they often do have cost estimates. They did that, throughout all of the rules that are coming out for the health care overhaul, for example. But this prescribes a way, once that determination is made, to basically say this cannot be implemented unless Congress specifically passes a law that implements the rule.
You mentioned that the White House is opposed to the bill. They've issued a statement of administration policy, and you said you don't think it'll go. The Senate will take it up. Well, why is the House spending its time, House leadership, bringing to the floor bills that deal with the government regulations and bills of this type?
Well, specifically, this law right now, if you disapprove of a government regulation, you use something called the Congressional Review Act, which requires both chambers to pass a resolution of disapproval, requires the president to sign something before the regulation can actually be walked back. They feel that this gives Congress the upper hand by designating majority leaders to say, yes, we approve of this rule, referring it to the relevant committees, and actually having legislation that basically endorses each rule that they find favor with. So it's essentially giving the legislative branch and their approach more of a, I guess, the upper hand in the rulemaking process.
Joining us from Capitol Hill with an update, Adriel Bettelheim, who is editor of CQ's Morning Briefing. Thanks for being with us.
And again, the underlying bill, known as the REINS Act, would require congressional approval of any regulations costing more than $100 million. The first of 7 amendment votes here, Steve Scalise's amendment, would subject any regulation that places a fee, price, or levy on pollution to the congressional approval procedure that's mandated under the bill. This bill, part of a series of bills brought forth by the Republican leadership this week on government operations and regulations. Look for a news conference by House Republican leadership talking about their effort. We'll cover that later today, and likely live coverage on the C-SPAN networks as well. As this vote continues, it's a 15-minute vote, and all of the remaining amendment votes will be 2-minute votes. As this vote continues, we'll bring you some of the debate on the bill from last night on the House floor, starting with Democrat Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, and I thank my friend from Tennessee and thank him for his able leadership in this bill. Listening to our friends on the other side of the aisle, I urge them all to reread Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, because that's where you would take us. You would take us to a world in which there was no federal oversight of the food supply in America. There was no oversight on child labor in America. There was no oversight on workplace safety in America, and tragedies ensued. America's water, America's air is cleaner, more breathable, and healthier today precisely because of regulation. The narrative that all regulation is burdensome, it only entails a cost, it never entails a benefit, is absolutely false and needs to be rejected by this body. Sadly, Mr. Chairman, it's once again shaping up to be a lost summer for Congress, as a number of issues ripe for debate, not this one, will be left to wither on the vine as members leave town for the next 5 weeks. That's frustrating after this year began with so much promise. I was pleased to be part of a bipartisan coalition that voted for the New Year's Day deal to avert the fiscal cliff. A few weeks later, that same bipartisan coalition banded together to provide emergency aid to communities ravaged by Superstorm Sandy. Thankfully, our success didn't stop even there. We came together again on a bipartisan basis to reaffirm the strong support for the Violence Against Women Act after it had languished in this body because leadership refused to compromise. At that point, people were actually beginning to wonder if the 113th Congress had finally gotten the message that the American people want us to work together to get things done, not to just make cheap political points. But sadly, that progress was not sustained. The first fissure appeared after the Senate's adoption of its first budget in nearly 4 years. I guess my friends on the other side of the aisle, the House Republicans, who had repeatedly beat up on the other chamber for not doing its job with respect to the budget, are now dumbfounded that they in fact did pass one, because it's been 4 months and they still have yet to appoint members to the conference committee they claimed they wanted. Then the Senate managed to pass bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform, mirabile dictu. Our Republican colleagues may talk a good game on immigration, but that's all they've done so far here in the House. Not one of the bills in their piecemeal approach has come to this floor for consideration. And just recently, House leaders allowed extreme partisanship to not only derail what was originally a bipartisan farm bill, but to also cast aside a critical safety net that was founded on a bipartisan basis in both the Senate and the House decades ago to protect families who need help putting food on the table. The list of unfinished business continues to grow as we enter the final days of summer, but where is the urgency to resolve them? I was puzzled to see House Republicans bring up a so-called jobs bill that once again provided less infrastructure funding than we did the previous year in what was called the T-HUD appropriation bill. And of course, it wasn't a surprise. They had to pull it from the floor in the face of bipartisan opposition. Their parting shot of this week will be the 40th attempt to repeal part or all of Obamacare. That's 40. When we return from this ill-timed recess, Congress will have just 9 legislative days to reach a deal on keeping government open for business beyond the end of the fiscal year, and by that time we're going to be bumping up against the debt ceiling. We actually managed a bipartisan accord to suspend that debt ceiling earlier this year, but we haven't been able to rekindle that spirit of cooperation. Mr. Chairman, the American people aren't taking 5 weeks off like we are, and neither should this Congress. We can't afford another lost summer. They yield back.
Gentleman from Virginia yields back. Gentleman from Tennessee reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 4 minutes to the chairman of the Subcommittee on Regulatory Reform, Commercial and Antitrust Law, the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Backus.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank the chairman, and the gentleman from Fairfax, Virginia, has just told us we have avoided the physical cliff. I wonder if our children and grandchildren can take any comfort in that. I had no idea that the deficit and the debt had gone away. I'd been told they were increasing by billions of dollars every day. We have another difference of opinion across the aisle. Our colleagues are saying we need more federal regulations, those that are covered by this bill that cost $100 million or more. We on this side of the aisle think that we could do well with a few less more regulations. Yes, every president has added regulations, every administration, and that we're supposed to say that that is a good thing. Regulations today cost $11,000 per American worker. Now, that's not taxes. That's not your Social Security. That's not their expense. That is just the federal regulations. 14% of our national income, according to Dr. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, our former Congressional Budget Office Director, 14% of our national income is being absorbed by federal regulations. 14%. Now, the gentleman from Tennessee says there were all these regulations before. In the Obama administration, they passed very few regulations. Well, not according to Dr. Holtz-Eakin. He actually says that in the last 4 years, the Obama administration has added over $500 billion worth of new regulations. Boy, so it's not it may be Groundhog Day, but we're another $500 billion deeper in federal regulations. Well, but let's talk about one family. Let's talk about one family and what regulations mean to them. One regulation caused American families to pay $20 more for a bronchial dilator. $20 more. And that was despite the fact that in 1987 in Montreal there was an accord. And the reason the FDA said we're not going to allow an ozone-depleting substance to come out of these bronchial dilators. So they banned it. And immediately in 2008, the cost of these bronchial dilators went from $6 and $8 up to as much as $30. Well, you know what the effect of that was? Let me tell you what the New York Times said. The New York Times described this as a rough transition to new asthma inhalers, because several million Americans suddenly were paying $20 more, and some couldn't afford it.
Chairman, I'm happy to yield an additional minute to the gentleman from
Gentleman is recognized for one additional minute.
Some couldn't afford it. I'll say to the gentleman from Virginia, the gentleman from Georgia, the gentleman from Tennessee. Several million Americans were suddenly being forced, some elderly, some children, to pay $20 more for what had been a $7 or $10 item. And you know what happened? A lot of them couldn't afford it. And there were more asthma attacks, and there was more bronchitis, and there was emphysema increased. And that was despite the fact that in Montreal in 1987, there was an accord that said, number one, that substance in a medical inhaler was essential and was accepted from the accord because the ozone was improving, number one. But number two, even if you banned all non-industrial discharges of ozone-depleting substance, all of them, it wouldn't do any good. It would have an insignificant effect. And of the non-industrial discharges, the amount from medical inhalers was infinitesimal. Yet, we denied millions of Americans an essential health item.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Virginia reserves. Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Before I yield to Mr. Johnson, I would say that I could respond to some of the statements that the gentleman from Alabama made, but I won't do it because I have the highest respect for him. He's one of the finest members of this House. And I yield 5 minutes to Mr. Johnson.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to H.R. 367, the REINS Act. I have profound concerns with the REINS Act. This bill would undermine the ability of agencies to protect the public interest. It is a continuation of the majority's obstructionist approach that led to sequestration. This deregulatory train wreck threatens to send us back to the days before the Wall Street collapse, a financial catastrophe that could have been avoided by responsible policies. This bill comes from the same brain trust that pulled the bill for transportation funding yesterday. Apparently, $4.4 billion in budget cuts is not good enough for these Republicans. And now we consider the REINS Act, a bill that would require Congress to have the final say on regulations. Stop and think about that. The same House Republicans that could not vote to fund transportation now wants to have the final say on all major rules. Never mind that Congress already has that power under the Congressional Review Act. Never mind that House Republican leadership tried this same maneuver in 2011. If Republican leadership truly believed in growing the economy and creating jobs, we would have come together with a grand bargain long ago. We could even vote on job-creating legislation to strengthen the middle class. But instead, this Republican Congress insists on voting on a messaging bill that will go absolutely nowhere. Few Americans are surprised by yet another Republican leadership failure that has become par for the course. Mr. Speaker, millions of Americans are still out of work. As we go back to our districts over the recess, I hope my Republican colleagues can look into the eyes of the poor and the unemployed in their communities and say, don't worry, I voted for a messaging bill to deregulate America. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Georgia yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Tennessee reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes on this job-creating legislation to a great new member of the House Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith.
The gentleman from Missouri is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 367, the REINS Act of 2013. As a member of the Subcommittee on Regulatory Reform and a co-sponsor, I'm pleased to see a good reform bill like REINS come to the floor. Regulations impose hundreds of billions of dollars, in fact trillions of dollars, on family farmers and small businesses, which significantly affect our economy and job creation in southeast Missouri. Businesses and individuals face an uncertain regulatory future, and this gives them pause as they seek to start or grow their businesses to encourage economic growth and create jobs. The REINS bill adds just a little more certainty to the process. It allows these individuals to hear about regulations and give input to Congress before they vote up and down on an agency rule. As I travel across Missouri, I always run into business owners, family farmers, and individuals who have felt the sting of government and their overreach. With the over 170,000 pages of rules and regulations affecting their lives. The pie-in-the-sky regulations here in D.C. have real effects back home. The voice of the American people through their elected representatives should be the determining factor in government regulation, not from a beltway bureaucrat. I urge your adoption of the REINS Act. I yield the rest of my time.
The gentleman from Missouri yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you. I yield 3 minutes and 53 seconds to the gentleman from Connecticut.
Gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 3 minutes and 53 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to oppose this misguided piece of legislation which would erect new obstacles and red tape to protecting American lives. At the outset, let me just reiterate what Mr. Cohen said earlier in his opening remarks, which is that Congress already has the power to disapprove any rule through the Congressional Review Act, through appropriations process, and through other authorizing legislation. H.R. 367, let's face it, is essentially an attempt to impose a procedural chokehold on protecting American citizens, and I want to talk about one of those proposed rules, which is now pending at OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which is a rule to prevent the continuing litany of workplace fire and explosions from combustible dust. Unfortunately, the Rules Committee didn't see fit to allow an amendment offered by Representative George Miller to exclude that rule from the underlying bill. It has been abundantly clear for a decade that federal regulatory action is needed to prevent combustible dust explosions and fires. In 2003, the Chemical Safety Board found that protections to stop these explosions were grossly inadequate. The board identified hundreds of other combustible dust fires and explosions, causing at least 119 fatalities, 718 injuries over the last 15 years. And the investigators themselves are not alone in demanding action. Tammy Miser of Kentucky testified before Congress recently about how her brother Sean was killed in a metal dust fire at an aluminum wheel plant in Huntington, Indiana in 2003. She told us how he was left lying on a smoldering floor after the explosion while aluminum dust burned through his flesh and muscle tissue, and each breath caused his internal organs to be burned even more. Sean wasn't the first to die at work this way, and he hasn't been the last. It has been more than 5 years since the Imperial Sugar explosion in Georgia, an explosion that killed 14 workers. It caused hundreds of millions of dollars in damage because an unchecked accumulation of sugar dust ignited and caused a chain of explosions leveling the plant. These workplace explosions have not stopped. There have been 49 major combustible dust fires or explosions that have killed 18 and injured 131 workers since Imperial Sugar. More recently, 5 workers were killed in 3 separate events at a factory north of Nashville because an iron powder processing plant failed to abate repeated dust hazards. Each of the 5 left behind a wife and child. One had 4 children under 11. Another became a grandfather the day before he was killed. Widows have called on their government to protect them, and that's where OSHA comes in. In 2009, OSHA finally started work on a rule to reduce the risk of these explosions. There will be small business panels, risk assessments, public hearings, and plenty of opportunities for comments. Despite the clear need to move forward, this bill would give special interests a new way to block needed protections, and they are already lining up to kill a rule they dislike. The sad truth is that the underlying bill is nothing more than an effort to put the powerful above the lives and limbs of working families and their widows. I urge my colleagues to vote down this bill. And if I have another few seconds, I just want to say we're now hours away from a 5-week recess. 640,000 DOD civilian employees are looking at Congress asking why they should be furloughed for the next 8 weeks, losing 20% of their pay, some of whom are doing critical work for our national security, and yet not once in the over 200 days since this Congress was sworn in has the governing majority brought a bill to this floor to turn off sequester and make sure that these people who are doing critical work for our national security can do their job. That's what we should be focused on. We should cancel the recess, turn off sequester, and end the endless debate about bills that are headed nowhere. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Connecticut yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Tennessee reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, at this time it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong support of the REINS Act. The REINS Act is needed, frankly, because for decades now, Congress has abdicated its responsibility for lawmaking to unelected federal elites in the executive branch. They often create overbearing regulations that stifle innovation, reduce productivity, prevent businesses from growing and adding jobs, and increase prices on everything from gasoline to groceries. Don't get me wrong. Some regulations are good and necessary, but they come with substantial costs, and there is not enough accountability for them. And I would look forward to voting for good regulations, and I would think my colleagues across the aisle would also look forward to voting for good regulations and taking credit for them. At this moment, however, the Obama administration has regulations in the pipeline that could cost the American people more than $50 billion.
176, the amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on Amendment Number 3, printed in Part B of House Report 113-187 by the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. Clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment Number 3, printed in Part B of House Report Number 113-187, offered by Mr. Smith of Missouri.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a recorded vote will rise. Sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote.
The House is working its way through amendment votes, 7 amendment votes, to a bill that would bar major federal agency regulations from being implemented that would have an economic impact of over $100 million unless they got congressional approval. An amendment here which would subject all the rules under the authority of the Affordable Care Act, the 2010 health care law, to congressional approval under this bill.
This vote, the yeas are 227, the nays are 185. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 4, printed in Part B of House Report 113-187 by the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Latham, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-187, offered by Mr. Latham of Iowa.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a recorded vote will rise. Sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Once again, this is a 2-minute vote.
The House, with an early start today, they gavelled in at 9 o'clock Eastern and quickly returned to finishing up work, votes on a bill that would require Congress to approve any regulations costing over $100 million. Tom Latham of Iowa, with an amendment that would require those agencies to report to Congress on proposed or prospective regulations or regulatory actions by other federal agencies. It's another 2-minute vote. There are 4 more amendments to be voted on. We expect a Democratic motion to recommit and final passage coming up shortly. And then the House will move on to its final bill before the August recess, a bill that, according to the Associated Press, will be the 40th time that House members plan a vote for on Republican legislation to overturn the 2010 health care law. The unemployment number came out today. The rate is at a 4.5-year low of 7.4%. The Labor Department saying the rate fell from 7.6% in June, with the economy adding 162,000 jobs.
This vote, the yeas are 263, the nays are...
Mr. Ryan of Ohio. Mr. Ryan of Ohio votes no.
The yeas are 263, the nays are 152. The amendment is adopted. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on amendment number 6, printed in Part B of House Report 113-187 by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 6, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-187, offered by Mr. Nadler of New York.
Recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a recorded vote will rise and be counted. Sufficient number having risen. The recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic devices. It's a 2-minute vote.
Jerry Nadler, Democrat of New York, with an amendment that would exempt the bill's congressional approval requirement from any rule pertaining to nuclear reactor safety standards. Another 2-minute vote. and we expect shortly a final passage vote coming up as well. At about this hour, the Vice President is swearing in the new United Nations Ambassador Samantha Power. She was approved by the Senate in their final vote before the August recess yesterday afternoon. She takes the job on going into a weekend where the U.S. is going to be closing its embassies worldwide. The Associated Press reporting the U.S. closing embassies and consulates throughout the Muslim world on Sunday after receiving an unspecified threat. The State Department officials made this announcement yesterday out of, quote, an abundance of caution. That from the State Department.
This vote, the yeas are 186, the nays are 229. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on amendment number 7, printed in Part B of House Report 113-187 by the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. Clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 7, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-187, offered by Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a recorded vote will rise. Sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 2-minute vote.
The bill, the REINS Act, would bar major federal agency regulations from being implemented without congressional approval if they have an economic impact of more than $100 million. Hank Johnson, Democrat of Georgia, has an amendment that would exempt from the bill's congressional approval requirement any rule that the Office of Management and Budget determines would result in net job creation. The amendment would ensure that rules that create jobs can go into effect. On jobs, the unemployment number came out today for July, the unemployment rate dropping from 7.6 to 7.4%. The House working its way through a number of votes on this, their last day before the August recess. The National Journal writing about what Congress will do over the recess. They say, Tim Griffin of Arkansas says, I will be having sweet tea at some point, my version of a town hall, he says, before ticking off at least a dozen events, including visits to a Best Buy, meetings with a pastor, post office namings, and a trip to the beach with his family. John Thune, Senator of South Dakota, says National Journal, will be heading back to his home state for the wedding of his daughter. It was planned during the August break for reasons, said Senator Thune.
Both the yeas are 182, the nays are 235. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on Amendment Number 8, printed in Part B of House Report 113-187 by the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment Number 8, printed in Part B of House Report Number 113-187, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a request for a recorded vote will rise to be counted. Sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Again, a 2-minute vote.
Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas with an amendment that would prohibit the underlying bill from impeding the Department of Homeland Security from issuing regulations. Another 2-minute vote, one more amendment after this, and then the Democratic motion to recommit, and final passage expected shortly thereafter. Part of this REINS Act, part of several bills the Republican leadership has been working on dealing with federal government operations and regulations. The House and Senate both this week tried to move forward on spending for 2014 but fell short. Wall Street Journal writing about that today, saying Congress's reeling budget process stumbled again Thursday as the Democratic-controlled Senate failed to advance a bill to increase spending for transportation and housing programs. They write the vote came on a day after a companion bill to cut spending for those programs collapsed in the Republican-controlled House because of lack of support. From the Wall Street Journal, they say that the twin failures show the struggle leaders of each chamber face in moving legislation and the distance between the parties in reaching agreement on spending bills needed to keep the government operating. Again, after the House gavels out today, 5 weeks for the August recess, they're back in early September, and the end of the fiscal year is September 30th.
The yeas are 185, the nays are 232. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on Amendment Number 12, printed in Part B of House Report 113-187 by the gentlewoman from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment Number 12, printed in Part B of House Report Number 113-1